Have you ever stood in the main reading room of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it is an incredible space.
It really is. And if you haven't been there, I want you to just picture it for a second. You walk into this massive, breathtaking room. You're surrounded by millions of books, basically the sum total of human knowledge, and you naturally just look up.
You can't help it. The architecture just pulls your eyes up.
Exactly. And right at the top of that monumental dome is this stunning 19th century masterpiece of a mural. Most people probably just admire the colors, the sheer scale of it before looking back down at their desks.
Which is a shame, honestly.
It is, because today we're going to look much closer at that ceiling. Because hidden right there in plain sight is a piece of history that completely shatters the modern narrative you and I were handed in school about the Islamic world and Western science.
It's a profound piece of public art, and it holds a really big secret. So today we're doing a deep dive into a very specific, very thought-provoking blog post from a platform called Knowledge is King.
Right, written by Mark Wells.
Yeah, published on March 11th, 2026. The piece is titled The Hidden History Above Our Heads: Islam in the Heart of Washington, D.C.
And our mission for this deep dive is to explore the historical facts, along with the broader arguments presented in this post. It's a text that touches on history, on the evolution of science, and really on how political narratives actively shape our collective memory.
It asks us to reconsider what we think we know about the foundations of our own civilization by looking at the physical evidence left behind by the people who built our institutions.
Now, before we jump in, I want to explicitly remind you, the listener, that our goal here is to act as your impartial guides.
Absolutely.
We're exploring the author's arguments and the historical timeline laid out in the text to help you navigate this fascinating subject. We are not endorsing any specific political ideology or, taking sides on modern geopolitics.
We are simply reporting on the source material to see what we can learn about the way history is remembered.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the visual evidence on that massive dome. The mural is called The Evolution of Civilization, and it was painted in 1896 by an artist named Edwin Blanchfield.
And it was designed to be a visual map of human progress. It features 12 distinct figures.
12 figures, yeah. And each one represents a different culture or nation that helped build Western civilization as we know it today. So you have Rome, Greece, England, Germany.
All the expected heavyweights.
Right. But there is one figure among those 12 that completely disrupts the timeline we're usually taught.
That would be the figure representing Islam.
Yeah.
But it isn't merely that Islam is included alongside those European figures. It's what Islam is specifically paired with. Blanchfield paired the figure of Islam with the field of physics.
Which is wild. I am stuck on this image because the imagery is so deliberate. The figure of Islam is depicted holding two very specific objects. One is a glass retort.
Which, if you aren't familiar, is that classic teardrop-shaped glass vessel with a long, downward-pointing neck.
Yeah, the one you always see in old alchemy or chemistry drawings.
Exactly.
And the other object is a book of mathematical calculations. So you have this very permanent painting right in the heart of the American government depicting the Islamic world as a literal bastion of hard science.
It's a striking choice.
But wait. If Blanchfield was painting this in 1896, right at the height of Western imperialism and expansion, why would he concede the pinnacle of hard science to Islam? Wouldn't an American artist at that time have picked a European figure for physics?
What's fascinating here is that in the late 1800s, this pairing wasn't controversial at all.
Really?
No, not even a little. It wasn't some radical fringe theory. This was common academic knowledge among the architects of American culture. They didn't view Islam through the lens of modern geopolitical conflict.
Okay.
Instead, they recognized a very specific historical truth, which is that Islam acted as the intellectual bridge that quite literally saved Western science. They viewed the Islamic world as the guardian of science.
That completely reorients the map.
Yeah.
Because the mural places Islam as a fundamental pillar, sitting as an absolute peer right alongside Rome and Greece.
Yes.
It wasn't seen as an other or some outsider culture that America was defining itself against. It was recognized as a vital ancestor of the modern world.
That concept of being a peer among equals is so crucial to understanding the 19th century mindset. Academics of that era understood the immense debt that modern physics owes to Islamic scholars. The label physics in the mural is a direct nod to pioneers like Ibn al-Haytham.
Also known as Al-Hazen, right?
Yeah.
He is specifically called out in the text as the father of optics.
He is, which highlights a massive geographical and temporal paradox that our standard education often glosses over. Think about the way we're taught the Dark Ages in Europe.
Oh, yeah. We're given this image of a time when scientific inquiry just ground to a total halt after the fall of Rome.
Right.
You picture monks shivering in unheated stone monasteries, just desperately trying to remember how to read, while the rest of the continent forgets how to build aqueducts.
It's a very bleak picture. But contrast that intellectual winter with what was happening in the East. Islamic scholars were not just passively preserving old knowledge, they were actively advancing it.
Advancing it, yeah.
While Europe was in the dark, cities in the Islamic world were bustling metropolises with streetlights, public hospitals, massive libraries. They were perfecting the scientific method, inventing algebra, and preserving the Greek and Roman texts that would eventually spark the European Renaissance.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The true history of Europe is actually inseparable from the Islamic world. For centuries, the true intellectual centers of what we think of as Europe weren't in London or Paris.
Not at all.
They were actually in places like Al-Andalus, which is Islamic Spain, and in Sicily.
Scholars from all across the European continent would travel to cities like Cordoba specifically to learn. It was the Oxford or MIT of the 12th century.
Wow.
They were traveling there to study medicine, astronomy, logic. The knowledge wasn't flowing from the west to the east. It was flowing entirely from the east to the west.
To really drive this home, the blog post includes a timeline, which it calls the knowledge relay, from Baghdad to the Renaissance. Let's walk through this, because seeing it laid out chronologically, stop by stop, it really changes your perspective on how human progress actually happens.
It does. It wasn't just a sudden flash of genius in Italy.
Right. So the timeline begins in the 8th and 9th centuries in Baghdad with an incredibly ambitious project called the translation movement.
And the key contribution here was the meticulous gathering, preservation, and translation of classical works. The source specifically names Aristotle and Euclid.
And it wasn't just hoarding books. By translating these foundational texts into Arabic, they literally preserved Greek philosophy and mathematics for the world. If that movement hadn't happened in Baghdad, the foundations of Western thought might have been lost to history forever, just rotting away in those freezing European monasteries.
Exactly. And building on that foundation, the relay baton is passed to Persia in the 9th century. The key contribution here is monumental. It's the invention of algebra.
Yeah, that's huge.
The source clearly states that this provided the foundational language for modern engineering.
Take a second to really think about the mechanics of that leap. Before this, Europe was primarily working with Roman numerals. Try doing complex multiplication, let alone structural physics, using Roman numerals.
It's impossible.
Right. Try multiplying all 14th by 7. It's incredibly clunky. The shift to Arabic numerals and the algebraic concept of using variables, the idea of solving for x, completely revolutionized our ability to calculate force, mass, and tension.
You simply cannot build a modern suspension bridge or a skyscraper or an airplane without the mathematical language that was codified in 9th century Persia.
It's just wild to think about. Okay, so moving from the theoretical to the physical, the timeline brings us to the 11th century in Egypt.
This is where we see the creation of the Book of Optics, written by the scholar we mentioned earlier, Ibn al-Haytham. The timeline notes that this text created the foundation for the scientific method.
Which is another massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
We are usually taught to attribute the scientific method to much later European figures.
Yeah.
People like Francis Bacon or Galileo.
Sure.
We're taught that the idea of forming a hypothesis, running a physical experiment, observing the results, that is the European Enlightenment concept. But this source anchors its origins centuries earlier on the African continent in Islamic Egypt.
And finally, the table brings us back to the European continent, specifically to 12th century Spain, with the movement of Latin translations. This is the crucial bottleneck.
The bottleneck.
Yeah. All of this accumulated, refined, and expanded knowledge, the Greek philosophy, the Persian math, the Egyptian physics, it was all translated from Arabic into Latin in places like Cordoba and Toledo. From there, it poured into the rest of Europe, effectively ending the Dark Ages and fueling the Renaissance.
It is a 400-year relay race of human genius. Now, the author of the blog does provide an important critique of the mural itself, even while praising it. He notes that Blashfield's painting is still framed from a 19th century Eurocentric filter.
Right. And to clarify that term, a Eurocentric filter in this context means viewing all of human history as essentially a prologue that inevitably leads to the United States as the ultimate victor or inheritor.
Right.
The artist is still organizing the world to flatter 1890s America. However, the author argues that even with that heavy cultural bias, the 19th century architects couldn't ignore reality. They acknowledged an undeniable historical necessity, a pillar of science that modern textbooks have largely erased.
So what does this all mean? I want to ask you, the listener, to think about your own education for a second. Think about your high school history classes. If the founders of the Library of Congress in 1896 so clearly saw Islam as a foundational pillar of physics and Western civilization, why does hearing this today feel so surprising? Why does it feel like a shocking revelation? According to the source text, the transition from being celebrated as a vital contributor to being demonized in modern propaganda is actually a relatively recent historical pivot.
And this is where the blog post moves from historical analysis into a critique of modern societal narratives. The author breaks down this erasure into 3 distinct historical pivots.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first massive shift was colonialism. The text argues that in the 20th century, Western powers needed a robust justification for colonial rule over the Middle East and North Africa. To do this, they had to reframe the East as backward. And the author refers to this psychological process as Orientalism. To put that simply, Orientalism is a Western lens that deliberately exaggerated and distorted the East. It made the culture look exotic, sure, but more importantly, it made it look stagnant, irrational, and incapable of self-governance.
It's a highly effective narrative strategy because if you can paint a culture as intellectually inferior, if you can erase the memory that they invented the math you used to build your cities, it becomes much easier to justify taking control of their resources and their land under the guise of civilizing them.
And that leads directly into the second pivot the author points out, geopolitics, specifically in the 1970s and 80s.
The text notes that during this era, the archetype of the scientist in Western media was systematically replaced by the archetype of the radical. Think about the movies, the television shows, the news broadcasts you or your parents grew up watching during that time. An entire culture was suddenly filtered almost strictly through the lens of conflict, terrorism, and oil resources.
The visual representation completely flips. You go from the revered figure holding the glass retort and the math book on the ceiling of the Library of Congress in 1896 to an entirely conflict-driven caricature in popular media just a few decades later. The scholar is erased, and the adversary is born.
Which brings us to the third and final pivot the author identifies, which is collective amnesia. Specifically, the text points to the post-9/11 era.
Right.
The author argues that the pervasive clash of civilizations narrative, this idea that the West and the Islamic world are fundamentally incompatible and have always been at war, it further wiped out the memory of our centuries of shared scientific heritage. It solidified the amnesia.
And to illustrate just how deep this collective amnesia goes, the author shares an incredibly tangible, everyday example. It's a piece of this shared heritage that we carry around with us constantly, completely unaware.
This part blew my mind. Think about the phone in your pocket right now or the device you might be listening to this on. The author points out that the very word we use for camera comes directly from the Arabic word kamera.
It is a perfect micro example of the macro argument. We use cameras constantly. They dictate our social media, our memories, our daily lives, yet the linguistic root of the technology itself is a hidden testament to that 11th century work in optics happening in Egypt by Ibn al-Haytham.
He experimented with a dark room, a al-Bayt al-Muslim, which had a small hole letting in light to project an inverted image. The Latinized term became camera obscura, meaning dark chamber, tracing all the way back to that Arabic root. It's a literal piece of Islamic scientific history that we speak every single day without realizing it. We are using their optics to take our selfies while forgetting they invented the science.
It highlights the profound irony of the clash of civilizations narrative. You can't cleanly separate the West from the East when the West's technological dominance is built entirely on Eastern foundations.
You really can't.
And that brings us back to the ceiling of the Library of Congress. The author frames the physical act of standing in that room and looking up at that great dome today as something much more active than just appreciating art.
He calls it an act of unlearning.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author views the mural as a permanent physical resistance to modern propaganda. Because it was painted in stone and plaster over a century ago, it couldn't easily be deleted, edited out of a textbook, or quietly removed when political winds changed.
It's just up there.
It remains there as a stubborn, silent witness to a truth we used to know.
The text says it reminds every visitor that the foundations of the modern world are not just European, they are deeply, fundamentally rooted in the East. And it's worth noting that this theme of seeking out hidden truths, of unlearning conventional narratives, and of challenging globalist hegemony, it seems to be a major common thread across this entire text. Knowledge is king platform.
Taking a look at the wider context of the blog shows a writer consistently exploring these intersections of history, faith, and systemic power. He is trying to map out exactly how historical memory is weaponized.
Yeah, just to give you an idea of the ecosystem this post lives in, the source page lists several other intriguing titles from Mark Wells. There's one called Your Brain on Faith, Bridging Science and Islam, which clearly ties directly into the themes of the mural we just discussed.
Oh, absolutely. Pushing back against the idea that religion and science are inherent enemies.
Exactly. There's another called The Ghost of Terra Nullius, From Colonial to Globalism.
Terra nullius is a fascinating legal concept. It translates to nobody's land, and it was the legal doctrine European powers used to claim sovereignty over indigenous lands.
Right.
They essentially argued that because the native people weren't using the land in a European way, it was legally empty and ripe for the taking.
Exactly the kind of historical justification the author is deconstructing. There's even a piece titled The Great Contradiction, Why Islam Remains the Final Frontier Against Western Hegemony.
So this deep dive into a 19th century mural is very much part of a larger, ongoing project by the author to question the historical filters we've been handed and to look critically at the stories power tells about the past.
And that is really the core insight we can extract from this source material today. The narrative of human progress, the evolution of civilization, to use Blashfield's title, it was never a solo journey.
No.
It wasn't a single unbroken line of European brilliance echoing from Rome to London to Washington. It was, as the author beautifully puts it, a global relay race, one where the baton of science, math, and philosophy was carried for centuries by the Islamic world. They didn't just hold it, they sprinted with it, refining it and expanding it, saving it from being lost to the Dark Ages, before eventually passing it back to the West.
It completely reframes how you think about history. It isn't just about giving credit where credit is due. It's about recognizing that our modern world is a deeply shared inheritance. We are all standing on the shoulders of these scholars who traveled to Cordoba, who translated texts in Baghdad, and who mapped the stars and codified algebra in Persia.
This raises an important question, and it's the perfect thought to leave you with today. The blog makes a very clear, almost haunting point. The 19th century founders of the Library of Congress possessed a collective memory about Islam's role in science. To them, it was common, undeniable knowledge. Yet we, living at the absolute pinnacle of the modern information age, with access to more data, more books, and more historical records than any humans in history, have somehow forgotten it through a politically driven collective amnesia.
It's a wild paradox. We have all the information in the world in our pockets, using the camera technology they pioneered, yet we know less about the origins of our civilization than an American artist did in 1896.
It really makes you wonder what else has been edited out.
This raises an important question. If a massive mural painted in 1896 in the very heart of the American government contains a more inclusive, accurate, and scientifically grounded view of history than many of our modern textbooks, what other fundamental pillars of our civilization are currently hiding in plain sight? What other vital pieces of human history are painted on the ceilings of our institutions, carved into our monuments, or buried right there in the daily language you speak, just waiting for you to look up, pay attention, and finally unlearn what you think you know?